yeah, it's nice. I hope everyone's been keeping well. Anyone have any news?
Good morning, Rabbi.
Just a Baruch Hashem.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's good. It's good to see you.
Morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay, so why don't we get started? We were in Siman Beis in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and we're up to Sif Gimel in Siman Beis. We're learning about the laws of Ona'ah, which is either in some way exploiting the person on the other side of the table in any kind of transaction by taking advantage of the person's ignorance of the true value of the merchandise in question. So a buyer can exploit a seller by paying him less than what the true market value of an object is, and a seller can exploit a buyer by overcharging, and that's probably the more prevalent example in today's world. And we had mentioned that the criterion of what an actionable offense is 1/6, and we had said it's either 1/6 of the amount of money paid or 1/6 of the value of the merchandise. So it's somewhere between 16 and 20% is an actionable offense. And certainly if it's more than that, it's an actionable offense. If it's less than that amount, then it's not an actionable offense. But certainly lechatchila, a person should not knowingly exploit the ignorance of the other party. And then he points out that, and this is what we're going to be seeing now in Sif Gimel, that if we had seen in Sif Beis that if b'di'eved I had overcharged the customer, as long as it was less than 1/6, I'm not obligated to return the amount that I overcharged. And now Sif Gimel is sort of the follow-up to that, where we're going to let's read this together. Aval lechatchila, but before the fact, before the transaction is made, then you should always try to disclose to the other person that the transaction that you're about to enter into may involve either overcharge or underpaying, and that would be the most honest way of entering into a transaction. Chayev lahodia ta'uso afilu al pruta echas. You have to notify the, let's say the other person is the buyer. You have to notify the buyer that you are overcharging him, that he could easily purchase this somewhere else for less money, even for one pruta. Even if there's just one pruta of overcharge. Velo yone also, and you should therefore not do any kind of ona'ah by exploiting his ignorance. Va'av sheyesh lihistapek v'lomar shekol pachot mishlut ein shem ona'ah alav klal. He says, even though one could make the argument that perhaps there's no reason to tell a person, well, if it's just a few pennies, what's the difference? There may not even be an isser of ona'ah at all. El derech mekachu memkarhu, but rather that's just the norm in transactions. Ki lefa'amim halokeach chayfetz b'mekach Umosif alav damim yoter mishivuyo, upa'amim shehamocher mizazel b'mimkaro. Because it's quite prevalent that sometimes a person is in great need of a piece of merchandise, and he has no problem adding a little bit more to the market value just for the sake of convenience. And there are other times when a merchant doesn't mind reducing the price because he wants to get rid of the merchandise. She'ein chayfetz ze arev alav, either because he no longer wants this piece of merchandise in his store or in his possession, or maybe he's pressed for money, and so therefore he's sort of doing some kind of stress sale to be able to raise capital. And therefore, that's why, as long as there's not a significant amount of either reduction or addition to the price, there's no ona at all. There are those who make that argument, and therefore they would say that this halacha should not apply at all. That really, as long as I'm not overcharging or underpaying by a sixth or more, I shouldn't have to say anything. Mikol makom, nonetheless, Yirei Shamayim Yachmir La'atzmo. But while that argument has validity, a God-fearing person should not rely on that argument and should rather be machmir upon himself. Shelo yikanes lesafek lo ta'aseh shel Torah. Don't enter into even a possibility that you may be violating a negative commandment of the Torah. Va'afilu im hamit'aneh hu tagar ubaki biyoter ve'im darcho lit'ot. And let's say I'm a buyer, and I want to be able to get a bargain, so I offer him less than the market value on a piece of merchandise. And I know that the merchant is a very savvy merchant. He knows the prices of all of his merchandise, and I have no question that when I offer him less than what it's worth, he knows that I'm offering him less than what it's worth, because he never makes a mistake. Ein tolin ha'ona ela b'ta'uto. But you can't make that assumption. And you have to therefore be concerned that even sometimes experts make mistakes. And therefore you should notify the seller of the fact that, the fact that you only asked me this amount of money is a mistake, because I know that everywhere else they're asking much more than that. And therefore be as explicit as possible and explain to the guy, listen, you understand that even though this piece of merchandise is only worth 100, I have decided that I'm only going to sell, I'm selling it for 110. Are you aware of that? Now, once you say that, or if the buyer says, you realize this piece of merchandise is worth 100, but I'm only willing to pay 90. Are you okay with that? As long as you say that and you give full disclosure up front, then you obviate and remove any kind of potential Isser, Torah violation, by stating everything explicitly. I know, what just came to mind is that I think Amazon quite often makes mistakes, and there are other, like sometimes airlines will publish the wrong price on tickets. There's actually an online company that's run by frum Jews called dansdeals.com. Has anyone ever seen that? dansdeals.com. So what they
I've used it.
Yeah, what they will do sometimes is that they will publish they come out with a daily, so like a sort of magazine where they tell you all the deals that are available. And sometimes they'll even tell you United Airlines has published a mistaken fare, but take advantage of it now because they will honor it for the next 24 hours or something like that. And there are times when an airline will say, oh, we published a mistaken fare, we have to cancel your ticket because it was published by mistake. But there are other times where the airline will honor it. And I don't know what the laws governing mistaken publications of prices are. There is a story that I heard not too long ago about a guy who was just getting started on being a seller on Amazon, and he put up a laptop for sale, and immediately overnight, he checks his sales the next day, and he sees that every single one of the 250 laptops that he put up for sale have been purchased by the same person, and he couldn't believe it. So he went and then got an email from the guy saying, "My name is some Jewish name," and he says, "Don't worry, you don't have to sell me all of these laptops. But I knew when you published the price on these laptops that there's no way it was possible that the price you posted was the correct price. And I knew you must have made a mistake. And I wanted to save you the agony of having to ship these laptops and take a loss on them. So I reserved them all. But you can cancel the purchase and charge the actual price that they are worth." And the guy actually saved this buyer, this frum guy, saved him a huge amount of money by purchasing them all, or saying that he was going to purchase them all on Amazon, because he had actually made a mistake. So just because a person makes a mistake online doesn't automatically mean that you have a right to exploit that mistake. If anything, just the opposite. If you know that a person is undercharging, and there's no possible way that the item could be worth so little, then you have to, and you know it's a Jewish seller, that you have to be concerned that maybe he's making a mistake. You have to look out for his welfare as much as you're looking out for your welfare. You can't exploit someone because of their ignorance, and so that's really what this halacha is all about. Let's
So,
take
Rabbi, as you said, that's only if it's not disclosed. Like if a store is using a loss leader and they're saying that it's discounted from was and is selling now at this, and it's still deep discount, you're able to take advantage of it because they've recognized that they know the real price and they're selling it at a lower price. Is
Yeah,
that fair?
correct. Well, first of all, if it's a corporate entity that is not majority Jewish owned, you don't have to be concerned about this halacha at all, right? But let's say it's a grocery store in Muncie that's owned by Jews. So then you know, as long as you are certain that they are aware that this is a loss leader, and a lot of times stores do that in order to attract customers into the store, that they will take a loss on one product with the confidence that it'll bring people in the store and they'll buy other goods and they'll make up their losses that way. Doesn't always work that way, but that's certainly a business model that you're allowed to participate in. Okay, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Lechatchila wrote Salomar Kodem Shenasa Hamekach. In other words, this whole halacha is before the transaction is affected, you should give full disclosure. Lahudia ta'uto, you should notify the other party that there's either an underpay or an overcharge. Wrote Salomar bein hakona vein hamocher, that means both the buyer and the seller. V'hainu de'im hakona roeh shehamocher torah be'erich shavius hamecher. That is to say, that if the purchaser sees that the seller is making an error in the true value of the merchandise, shehu dorish pachos me'erko, that he's asking a price that is well below its market value, tzarech hakona lahodio ta'uso shehu shavi yoser. The buyer has to notify the seller, you're charging too little on this merchandise, you're going to be taking a loss. V'chein lahefech. And similarly, just the opposite. If the buyer is offering a price that is worth more than the value, the seller has to notify him that he's making a mistake because he's offering too much money. And even though, as we said in the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, that a person can make the argument that if it's within a sixth, above or below, that's just normal, and people, that's not even considered onah at all. But nonetheless, Yirei Shamayim Yachmir La'atzmo. And so the Imrei Yaakov just tells us why there's two different opinions. He says, Safik zeh mekoro b'divrei harash, umuva b'shulchan aruch, umasik al zeh harash, the Yirei Shamayim yitzei yidei shnehem. That both opinions are brought down in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Rosh, who's one of the Rishonim, tells us that a God-fearing person should take the more stringent position. So why? Because shelo yikanes l'savek, because there's actually a possibility of violating a negative commandment of the Torah. The Shema Kavanas HaTorah shelo ya'aneh et chavero afilu b'chol shu im yesh bo shava pruta. He says because maybe the Torah's intent is not just to not exploit someone if it's a significant amount. Maybe the Torah doesn't want you to exploit someone even if it's just a pruta. Ela sha'amru chachamim da'ad shtus derech ha'olam limchol ta'usam. But the rabbis use the estimate of 1/6 to say that if it's within a margin of a sixth, people are generally forgiving on this kind of error. Sha'afim yavo hamis'ana le'arer lo yashumo hashamayim b'shava dezeh yomer yesh ba'ona v'zeh yomer ein ba'ona. Hilchos mekabel alav shetika ve'ein ma'arer u'mocha. Why are generally people forgiving, if the amount is less than a sixth? The answer is because a lot of times the true value of something could be subjective based upon the sort of a fluctuation in the way people estimate the value of the something's value. So one estimator may say it's worth what you paid. Another estimator may say, no, it's worth less than what you paid. And usually there's a margin of difference between different estimators, and that's why people are generally moicha. But if you know for sure that this is clearly the market value, it could be that the Torah doesn't want you to deviate from that amount even by a little bit. And therefore it always pays to notify the other party in advance. Avalim eno mefarish. But if you don't say explicitly that I want you to know that you're overpaying for this item, Barak Omar Almanas Shein Bo Ona'a Lo Mo'il. He says, what if you just say, listen, I'm not interested in entering into negotiations and discussing the true value of this item, but I want us to make a deal. And let's say a seller puts up a sign at the cash register saying, all items that we sell in the store, the purchaser buys on the condition that he cannot claim ona'a afterwards. Does that kind of disclaimer help? So the Imrei Yaakov says, based on what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, lo mo'il. That kind of blanket disclaimer is not effective. The efshar lahasnos levatel din Torah, because you can't say, I'm selling you treif on the condition that you don't have any recriminations against me that it's treif. Similarly, I can't sell you something and rip you off, even if I say on the condition that you can't come after me because I ripped you off. In other words, you can't say that. I remember going to a kosher restaurant a number of years ago in LA when there was a certain amount of lawlessness in kashrus. This is, in the earlier days of kashrus in LA. And there was a sign in the pizza store that we don't check for bugs. That was the sign at the cash register. We don't check for bugs. So essentially what the seller was saying is he wanted to be honest, but he wanted to let people know that if you're going to order the broccoli souffle or whatever he was selling, you should realize that there may be bugs in there because we haven't checked the broccoli. So you have to decide whether you want to purchase this or not. And a lot of people eventually they abolished that because how can you say, buy this at your own risk? If the whole halacha is that I'm not allowed to sell you treif, how can I say, well, this may be treif, but you buy it at your own risk? Or if the halacha is that I'm not allowed to rip you off, how can you say, well, I may be ripping you off, but at least I've disclosed that I'm ripping you off? You can't, if the Torah says don't rip someone off, you can't rip them off, even if you notify them that you're ripping them off. So that doesn't help. So va'afilu im omar almanas she'en lecha alai ona nami lo moel desover dein bo ela pchas kol dehu v'lo machil. He says, and even if you say, I hereby sell you this item on the condition that you have no, that you agree not to have any recourse against me for having ripped you off, that also isn't valid, because it could be that the purchaser is thinking to himself that the margin of error is very, very slim, and therefore it's not worth it. But if it's a significant amount, you have to let him know. And this is the only way, therefore, to lichatchila avoid the problem of ona'ah, is if you tell the person the item is worth 100, but I'm selling it for 110. Are you okay with that? And if you tell him explicitly what the value is, then the Torah says that that's no longer ona'ah, because ona'ah is the exploitation of another party's ignorance, right? But let's say you've given full disclosure, then you have a right to charge as much as you want. Sheshave kach v'kach. V'davka, you have to tell him that it's worth so and so. V'davka ba'ofen zeh shehu mefaresh hasikum. And there you have to expressly tell him it's worth more. And you have to tell him how much more it's worth, or how much less it's worth. Avo lo sagi ba'omer lo stam sheyodea ani shehu shaveh yoter v'chulei. But it doesn't help if you say to the guy, let's say you're the buyer and you're offering him 90. It's not enough just to say to him, I know that your merchandise is worth more than 90, but I'm only willing to offer you 90. That's not sufficient. You have to tell him, I know the merchandise is worth 100. You have to make sure that there's no ignorance whatsoever. Because if you don't tell him how much money he could be getting for the merchandise, so then there still may be onah. So in our example, if the guy goes to a garage sale that we talked about before, and there's an old edition of Action Comics, right, and it's really worth $1,000, and you offer him $50 because he's ignorant, and you say to him, listen, $50 is what I can do. I'm sure if you took it to a comic book shop, you could probably get more for it. So according to this opinion, that's not sufficient. If you know it's worth 1,000, then, and you're just telling him, well, it's worth more if you go to get it appraised, that I'm sure you can get more for it, that's still not enough, because the fellow may think, well, maybe I can get 60 for it if I schlep it to a comic book shop, right? He doesn't realize that he's actually selling something that is worth much, much more. There's another opinion that says even if you don't tell him what it's actually worth, as long as you tell him it's worth more, then you've fulfilled your obligation and there's no more onah. Ach im amar le chayfetz ze eno shave elazuz echad al manas she'en lecha alai onah bazel lekuli alma yesh onah mishum deyesh lomer de lahashbiach mekcho kivin. But then he gives us one final caveat, and that is as follows. There's a difference of opinion, as I just mentioned, as to whether you have to tell him what you feel the actual value of the merchandise is, whether you're a buyer or a seller. According to the second opinion, if you tell him that it's definitely worth more if you're the buyer, or if you're the seller, if you tell him, I know that it's worth less, but this is what I'm charging. So one opinion says that that's not enough, and another opinion says that that's enough, as long as you tell him that and you say, are you okay with that? So then, according to the second opinion, you fulfilled your obligation. But even according to the second opinion, let's say you take an object that's worth approximately 100, and you're the seller, and you say, this is only worth $1, and it's clearly not worth $1. So if you tell him that, and you say, this is worth $1 and I'm charging $100, so then that's not sufficient to cover your disclosure that you're selling it for more than what it's worth. And what is the reason for that? So that, as the Meforshim explain, the Sma explains that essentially the reason why you're telling him it's only worth $1 is because you're exaggerating. You're telling the guy, look, you're essentially implying to him, clearly you see it's not worth $1. And therefore, when I told you it's worth $1, I was just joking around and trying to assure you that you're getting a good deal by paying $100 for it. So when you use language that will potentially mislead the customer by making him think that he's getting a bargain when he's really not, so then that's ona. That's one of the definitions of the very definitions of ona, is making a person feel that he's getting a bargain when in reality he's paying more than what the market would bear. So okay, so that's that halacha. Let's just see if there's any. Okay, why don't we take a look at the biurim for just a moment and see the source of this halacha. You have to notify that the item is worth a certain amount. You should let him know what it's worth, and if he wants to pay more, then that's his prerogative. So the biurim writes, he says, Mekor din zeh behazahav nun aleph amud beis. The source of this halacha is in Bava Metzia, page 51b. Tanya Bamed Dvar Mamurim Bistam, where the Gemara says that ona'ah exists when you don't give any disclosure. Avol b'mefaresh mocher sha'amar lelokeach. But let's say the seller is explicit and he tells the buyer as follows: Chayfet zeh sha'ani mocher lecha b'masayim yodea ani bo she'eno shaveh elamane. He says, I am selling this merchandise for 200. But I happen to know that it's only worth 100. If you went somewhere else, you could get it for 100. Al menas she'en lecha alai ona'a, ein lo ona'a. So if I say, I give you full disclosure, and I tell you that it's only worth 100, but I'm selling it for 200, are you willing to purchase it nonetheless with the acknowledgement that there will be no recriminations afterwards of ona'a? So then the halacha is, says the Gemara, that if the buyer nonetheless purchases it for 200, since he's been given full disclosure, there is no law of ona'ah there. V'chein lokeach sha'amar l'mocher chayfet zeh shani lokeach mimucha b'maneh yodea ani bo sheshava masayim al manas shein lecha alai ona'ah ein lo alav ona'ah ad kan. And similarly, if a buyer says to a seller, he says, I'm offering you $100, even though I know the merchandise is worth 200. Are you maskim? Do you agree to this? And do you agree that there will be no recriminations afterwards of ona'ah? And the guy says yes. So then that's totally okay. It's a two consenting transactors are entering into a willful transaction with full disclosure. He says, Umuva b'shulchan aruch siman reish chaf zayin sif chaf aleph because of sham hasma sif kat lametes v'zelushono mashma dispir le delo sagi v'armer le stam yodeya ani sheyesh bo ona shetzarch sheyifar sho. He says, so the Sma and the Shulchan Aruch writes, when he comments on this halacha, that it's not just enough to say that I know that this is worth less than what I'm charging, or I know this is worth more than what I'm willing to pay. You have to actually explicitly say that it's worth only 100, right? Because let's say you say to the guy, the buyer, I'm selling this for 200, and I know that you could get it for less somewhere else. That's not enough, based on the language of the Gemara, where the Gemara had said explicitly, it's worth 100, I'm selling it for 200. Are you masking? Right? So you see that you have to actually notify the person, because if you're selling it for 200 and you tell a guy, I know you can get it cheaper elsewhere, the guy might think, okay, maybe I can get it for 180 elsewhere, but you're telling me I can get it for 100 elsewhere that I didn't know. And so it's not fair, right?
I guess it's how much effort is it worth me taking in order to save or spend more or less. And if
Right.
the differential is great, then you do it. But if it's small, you wouldn't. So it really doesn't tell you what you need to know.
Exactly. That's exactly the point that he's trying to make, right? Anyway, he goes on and on from there, but I just wanted to show you that that's the source of the halacha. Since the Gemara states that in its illustration that the person in the know is telling him exactly what it is worth, where he could get, or what its market value is, and I'm charging this amount more than the market value. You see that you have to be as explicit as possible in order to avoid this issur of ono. Okay? Questions, comments?
Rabbi, I had a question, and I want to use the comic book as an example. So let's say you find that Action Comics, and as you probably know, there is an accepted value. There's a price guide that will tell you what the value is. But if you're buying it as somebody who, let's say, is in the business, let's say it's worth $100. If you buy it as somebody who's in the business, if you're going to sell it for $100, you're not going to make any money on it. So typically people who are in the business will buy things from people who are selling for, let's say, 50%, 60% of the price, because if they buy it for exactly the value, they're not going to make any money on it, right?
Right.
So,
and a lot of times the seller will advertise that I'm selling it at 60% of its guide value.
right.
They have these price guides.
Correct.
And that's actually quite prevalent. That's a common practice.
Yeah. So my question would be is like, if you, let's say I'm in the comic book business and I go to the garage sale and I know it's worth $100 and the guy's selling it for $30, like, would I still be under obligation to tell him just, this is worth $100, right?
Well,
because
so you probably in that kind of situation where that the prices fluctuate wildly depending upon whether people adhere to the price guide or whether they sell it at a fraction of the price guide, it's probably better for you to tell him. In that kind of situation, you have to sort of evaluate, would this guy, if he took it to a comic shop, would he get something similar to what I'm paying? Or would he get far more? Because even people who would purchase it at a discount would certainly pay more than that.
right.
And the only reason the guy is selling it out of his garage is selling it for less is because he's clueless as to what it's really worth and what he really has in his possession.
Right.
Okay? So then you have to notify him. You have to tell him, listen, if you take this to a comic shop, you could probably get a lot more money than what I'm willing to pay for it. And you have to tell him it could be that you could even get up, maybe like $50, $60, and you're just selling it for $5. Do you still want to sell it to me?
I see. Okay. But it is you could say, like, especially if you're in that business, you could say, listen, if you take this to a comic shop, I can tell they're going to pay you $50 because that's the standard practice. So I'm willing to pay you $50. The only issue I would think of is that once you make the person aware it's worth $100, they could turn around to you and say, oh, well, if you're telling me that, then I'm going to charge you $100, right? Which they're not going to get from you and they're not going to get from the comic shop.
So as long as you educate them on this kind of commodity, on this kind of collectible in your example, you tell them, listen, no one pays a full guide value in today's world. If you take it to a comic shop, he's not going to offer you 100, even though the guide says that it's worth 100. As long as you educate him.
I see. Okay.
All right.
Shkoyach.
Everyone have a great day.
Welcome
Thank you,
back.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Be well. Take care.
Bye-bye.